Our speaker this evening is Alan Smith of the Financial Times. He'll be speaking to us on mapping the outlier, cartography at the FT in 2020. At the Financial Times, Alan leads the newsroom team of data reporters and visual journalists. He has a background in cartography and digital mapping and has spent the last decade finding ways of bringing statistics to wider audiences. Before he joined the FT, he was head of digital content at the Office for National Statistics, where he was awarded an OBE in 2011 for services to official statistics. Some of you may already have seen his TED talk from 2016, where he speaks about why we should love statistics. So in whatever virtual way you can, I'd like you to welcome Alan to the virtual podium. And Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And gosh, yes, it's such a lovely moment to be asked to give the autumn lecture for the Society in such unusual circumstances. It must be kind of acknowledged. But I mean, it is an honour, but I also feel a little bit like there's an apocryphal story of John Lennon was once asked if Ringo Starr was the best drummer in the world, and he said, he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. I do feel a little bit like that in cartographic terms, because I'm lucky enough to lead a really wonderfully talented team at the FT. We have some really wonderful cartographers, data journalists and visual journalists who I'm going to introduce you to by way of this lecture, and some of the things that have been, let's say, calling on our time this year. But it is wonderful to get the chance to speak to you, because as Richard briefly mentioned, I do have cartographic DNA, even though I practice cartography myself a little less frequently than I'd really like to. My undergraduate degree is in geography. My master's is in GIS, and so it's really lovely to have a chance to share our work with you and to talk about what we've been doing with cartography at the FT. And when I was thinking about the title for this talk, of course, it was a nice, what a year to be giving a talk like this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to present my screen, so you will hopefully concentrate more on my screen than my bedroom, and I'll step you through this talk, which I've called Mapping the Outlier, Cartography at the FT in 2020. And you may be thinking, what is the outlier that I'm talking about? And the outlier is, of course, 2020. It has been such an extraordinary year, the evidence of which is perhaps that I'm talking to you from my bedroom, which is probably the first time you've achieved that for the autumn lecture, to have that live from someone's bedroom. But it has been a really challenging year, a difficult year, I think, for everybody in so many different ways. For us at the FT, I think the one thing that I would say that's been very interesting about the experience of this year is it's been almost like the ultimate test of the visual and data strategy that we've been following for the last few years at the FT. And I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of that strategy, along with a little bit of history. And I think history is a great place to start, because if there's one word this year that's been used a lot, it's the word unprecedented. And of course, one of the things I love doing at an organisation like the FT, which can trace its history back to 1888, is it's lovely to go back through the archives and look what else we've done in the areas of cartography, data visualisation, visual journalism, and to see how we're doing now maps onto that. How it translates, how we've evolved, is also a good thing to be doing periodically. Now, the funny thing with the FT is it was a bit of an odd organisation for most of its first 60 or 70 years. Its journalism was of a particularly dry and empirical type that was delightfully free of graphics for the large part. But there are outliers, such as this one, which is a map that I kind of lay claim to this as being one of the world's first sort of interactive reader maps, right? So this was a map that was published in 1914 by the FT, a competition map, Europe after the war, instructions, sketch in the boundaries of states according to your view of probable peace terms. And so this is a map right at the outset of World War I, which presumed the war would be over relatively quickly. And if you look at the absence of any mapping detail whatsoever in the United Kingdom, that any of the boundary changes that were likely to happen would only be in continental Europe. You know, there's the Seine, but there's no Thames. Ireland barely gets a look in. So the reader is being told, look, don't draw on the UK because that will be safe. Draw everywhere else on this map and tell us what you think these boundaries are going to be like. Now, at the time, of course, there was a general kind of misconception that this war was going to be a fairly gentlemanly war that would end fairly quickly. And then the FT could award the prize to whoever drew the closest boundaries to the agreed peace terms. And of course, the lens of history allows us to see that that was such an utterly sort of naive view. And as the British Library noted, it's one of the few competitions where so many of the people who presumably entered it didn't quite get to see the end of it because of the utter kind of devastation that was to unfold across Europe over the next few years. So, I mean, we've actually, this kind of light-hearted map aside, we've always taken cartography very seriously at the FT. But I think even this map shows you how important the concept of boundaries and statehood still are to people. And that translates even to this year. Now, one of my sort of, one of my cartographic moments earlier this year was producing a map of the Russian elections, the Russian regional elections that happened in September, and being very careful to make it clear that although Russia was holding elections in the Crimea, particularly in Sebastopol, Crimea is annexed by Russia, but this is not recognized by the international community. Now, those were words that we actually agreed with the Ukrainian embassy because people are obviously taking the cartographic representation of things so seriously, but it didn't stop our readers getting so passionate about it. And this one in particular caught my eye, which was, you know, shame on you, Alan Smith, right? Which would be bad anyway until you realise that my wife's nickname is Lordy, and I started to think that this was the beginning of divorce proceedings as well as cartographic proceedings. But people take maps very seriously, readers. The map, the geography, the physicality of the map, much more important than any footnote. And that's kind of one of the learning points about the continuing and enduring power of maps. Maps are obviously therefore exploiting the power of visual encoding. That is, at its heart, what makes a map powerful. They resonate visually with people. And again, how you visually encode something is something that, as a news organization, you're constantly thinking about, you know, what is our language for visual encoding? How do we actually determine a strategy that allows us to kind of regularly and often very, very quickly produce content to a consistent standard that we are happy with. Now, again, this is where a tour through the archives comes in super handy, because our visual encoding strategies have changed over the years, from no graphics whatsoever through to full-on in-your-face infographics. And this is still my resounding favorite from the era of infographics at the FT. Not so very long ago, just 20 years or so ago, I refer to these as the testicular pie charts. And this is what happens when your visual encoding strategy for data is all about decoration and not designing with data. And this was hugely influential, this kind of visual style around the turn of the century. I mean, you can still see evidence of this sort of thing these days if you look hard enough. It's the sort of thing that Edward Tufte would call chart junk, I'm pretty sure. I think it's probably it's closest that there has ever been to a willy being in the FT, actually, this pair of sort of slightly ominously bulging underpants. We've changed our visual encoding strategy from this. Our visual encoding strategy these days is based around something called the visual vocabulary. This was something that we implemented in the FT newsroom about 4 years ago now. And what we were really after here was some way of organizing our visual strategy so that we were designing with data, not designing around data. So it might sound a little bit like a sort of anachronism, that this is actually a poster. It's designed to be a poster that you put up on the wall. If you are interested in this and looking at it in more detail, you can get your own copy of this for free from ft.com/vocabulary. That just takes you to our GitHub repository where you can download this as a PDF and print it up. Why do we make it a PDF? We made it a PDF because we wanted to have something physical that we could put in our newsroom, that we could socialize discussions about visual presentation of data. So what I mean by that is, you know, somebody not from my desk, but maybe wants to come to my desk and talk about how we might use visuals to tell a particular story. This is a way of kickstarting that conversation. And it's predicated on what do you want to show, which is crucially a very different question from what do you want, which is what happens when you end up with underpants and testicular pie charts. You know, that the discussion should be about what you are trying to communicate, and that is based on understanding the patterns in your data that you're really looking to share with readers. So across the top, it's going to be quite small on your screens here, but across the top of this poster, you've got the various graphical forms organized into columns based on relationships in data. So deviation, correlation, ranking, distribution, change over time, magnitude, part to whole. Over on the far side, flow, but there we are, second to the end is spatial. So spatial gets its own category on our visual vocabulary because we know spatial is special. The key point about this vocabulary is that it really is, you can think of it more like a visual thesaurus for visual presentation forms. And what it tries to show you really is that there's virtually never an instance where a visual presentation is completely optimized. Everything is a trade-off. You know, you can emphasize one relationship perhaps at the expense of another. And I think the spatial category is the one above all else, where not only are there lots of examples of that, but it's one that's absolutely bound up in the inertia of newsroom thinking. So the description that we wrote for the spatial category on this is only to be used when precise locations or geographical patterns in data are more important to the reader than anything else. So what it's basically saying is, you might have data that is geographical, but unless that geographical pattern is what you're trying to emphasize, then you shouldn't be putting it on a map. And that thinking was deliberately aimed at a kind of generation of news editors who instantly assumed as soon as you had a story that mentioned Paris, Luxembourg, and Frankfurt, that you had to have a map. Okay, and so very deliberately we started to push against that and to start to demonstrate how this visual vocabulary should be used. So I asked one of the cartographers in our team, Chris Campbell, to make a deliberately bad map of a request that came in for someone who said, I've got a map, I've got some data for a map here, we want to show which cities are being lined up to replace London as the banking centre of the EU. Annoyingly, Chris just can't make too many bad maps, and so this is still, you know, nicer than I wanted, but I think it still makes the point, which is what the reporter really wanted to show here was which cities are more, which cities are stronger in terms of their population of banks, in their banking presence, but also which banks are most federated across Europe already. So in terms of the first question, which cities are stronger? Well, you can kind of understand that on this map. You can see that London is this big sea of red. You can see that Lisbon is a smaller list of paler colours. So we can kind of get a sense for which cities are stronger. But when you turn your hand to the other task, which is how well federated are these banks, that's where the visual encoding here is working against you. So for example, trying to track how well federated is Goldman Sachs and how does that compare to Deutsche Bank? That's where this encoding fails. So on the visual vocabulary, we launched it into action and said, well, actually, this might be a more interesting way of doing it, certainly a more functional way of doing it, where we arrange the banks in rows, the cities in columns, we order them in both dimensions and just allow the reader to understand what the patterns are showing. So darker columns indicate a strong presence in a city, darker rows indicate the broad presence of a bank. And at the moment we started doing these before and after examples of when to use a map and when not, I think actually, as much as cartographers want to produce as many maps as they can, this actually really helped our cartography because it cut out, it allowed us to start to intercept and eliminate maps that we previously would have just nodded at, you know, and the idea that we were actually thinking about mapping as part of a broader data visualization toolkit allowed us to move on. Crucially, we didn't just stop at doing these examples. We wrote some of these examples up, and as part of our visual strategy, what we realized was the ultimate currency of the FT is an FT article. So let's write these as articles. And so when we justified this as a makeover, we wrote about it for readers, but what it was really aimed at was the other editors in the FT newsroom. And we started using very unsubtle titles like this one about, look, let's make fewer of these, right? And on similar topics, you know, let's not make everything interactive. It's a good way of communicating the strategy. What it also allowed us to do is to start to say to people, well, actually, you know what, if we can do that, then we can start to concentrate on using maps for where they can really make a difference. And this is a mapping project that we delivered about 18 months ago. And this was all looking at the state of the UK's broadband market, which is probably quite relevant to everyone who's kind of squinting at a very poor resolution screen on a Google Hangout right now. But really the interesting thing here was there was an expression of geographical curiosity at the outset of this piece. Where in the country is broadband better? Where is it weaker? What are the patterns? You know, who's winning the race for fast broadband? Who's being left behind? Now, the interesting thing about this piece was we used maps and cartography in two different ways. The first layer was at the analysis level, where we actually used tools like QGIS to take really quite large data sets and to scrutinize them in detail to produce this sort of summary graphic, which kind of gives a measure comparison of rural versus urban areas for their broadband speed. And it, you know, allowed us to see, for example, that in rural Shropshire, you were getting, you know, contrary to the popular notion that rural is always slower, urban is always faster, that there were places in Shropshire that were faster than Knightsbridge. And in fact, some parts of Knightsbridge were below the universal service obligation level of 10 megabits. So we had a great, the cartographic use to find the stories was interesting because it allowed us to do things like talk to the telecoms correspondent and say, hey, guess where the fastest internet in the whole country is? And if anybody's guessing, you're probably wrong, because it's actually in rural Cumbria, where we have this fantastic story where, if you can see here on this kind of reduced cartography, that this bright color represents fast speeds. Okay, very fast speeds. And in fact, I thought this was an error in the data when we first ran this, that they were saying that the internet speeds up here are about 1,000 megabits. And you can see it's really just a collection of distributed hamlets and villages in rural Lancashire and Cumbria. We talk to the telecoms correspondent and send him up there, and what he finds is a very human story of farmers laying fibre broadband through their own fields and generating gigabit internet speeds. I love this as well because we sometimes think of data as a dry and boring, you know, kind of not boring, but dry and dusty, right? Lacking sometimes the human element. But here we had a very human story where the farmers network was saying, it's not really about the speed, it's about the community. Everybody's pulled together. Most of the volunteers are 65 and they're as fit as butcher's dogs with all the trench digging. Their wives have fallen in love with them again because they've got their six packs back. So we had this lovely sort of human story emerge from this cartographic analysis. The other thing that we found was that, in fact, most city centres in the UK were running at much lower speeds than the surrounding areas, which again confounded a little bit of kind of received wisdom. The kind of real use of cartography here was to put the reader in the story too. So If you are, putting in your postcode, we can take you to your part of the world and put you on the chart that puts you in sort of comparison terms and allow you to share that information on social media. So you have this lovely map-driven combination of visual, personal, and social, which is a lot more fun than putting points on a map of Europe and telling people where Dublin is, which really just helped us to get that strategy going. So that was a good example. When we look at how we've covered coronavirus this year, COVID-19 really has kind of changed so much of what we do, but it's still resting on exactly the same principles based on that visual vocabulary about picking the right way, or sometimes several ways, that you might want to present data to look at it from different angles. This chart here is a chart that shows the stringency of government lockdowns. And if I can explain it to you, because you might not be able to read the text on this small screenshot, it is arranged geographically in terms of continents. So we've got each row is a country, they're organized into continental blocks. We have Asia, the Americas, Europe, Africa, and so on. Time runs from left to right on this chart, and the color shows the severity of the lockdown. So if you read this chart, it shows you that, for example, in Asia, that's where you first started seeing lockdowns, where things move away from the pale blue. And we can start to see, China's lockdown in Wuhan, January the 23rd, that occurred here. And then you can start to see the spread to other areas in terms of governments increasingly locking down across the world. So that is certainly one way of looking at that data set. It's interesting, it rewards examination, there's a lot to digest in it. We kind of want people to use it almost like as a dashboard, but it's not the only way of presenting that information. Here's another way, which is to pull together an animated map. So this is taking exactly the same data as the chart that's on the left and putting it into the mapping environment and animating it. And I think that animation carries with it some good points and bad points. It brings with it a payload. That's probably one of the bad points, is that unlike the chart on the left, you can't see all of the data at once. Okay, so you're having to do a lot of memorizing if you really want to take it all in. But that animation is also powerful because the animation draws your eye to places that are changing the most. And in the context of this story about how lockdowns emerged, the story of China to Italy to Europe to North America and Latin America comes out very, very powerfully. And it probably resonates far more visually with the reader than the chart on the left. Which one did we choose? We chose both in our story. If we go to our government stringency tracker, we use both of these graphics for that very purpose, that they show different angles on the same data, and the reader can actually understand a lot from using both. That thinking is not just applied to that visual vocabulary thinking is not just applied to presentations that you could think of as dashboards, like just here's some data, here are the latest numbers. We've applied it to the way that we tell stories as well. And I think that comes out most notably in this story that we published about a month ago, where we decided, as part of this FT series on could the coronavirus crisis have been avoided, or could lives have been spared, that we decided to use the collective data intelligence that we built during the crisis and use our storytelling methods to educate the reader, to inform the reader, to bring some. One of the things we realized was actually there were a lot of paradoxes to this crisis, lots of things that when you first looked at it didn't really seem to add up. The first of which was the paradox of China's containment, which was that the Wuhan lockdown on the 23rd of January couldn't really have come at a worse time for the people of China, certainly not for the mayor of Wuhan, because around about half of the population of Wuhan were already on the move across China by the time the city locked down, because the Lunar New Year is actually the largest annual human migration on the planet. So not a great time to have, shut the stable door after the horses have bolted across China. The paradox is that despite that extraordinary movement of people, that China managed to contain its COVID-19 outbreak to the province of origin, Hubei, which is where Wuhan is. The interesting thing here is already we're starting to see a slight shift in our visual presentation to tell that story from a fairly orthodox map of the departures to something that's more pseudo-geographic. It doesn't really matter where these provinces are, except we really want to be able to see the size of the caseload. Now, there were some issues certainly during this crisis about how far you could trust the official data coming out of China. But in fact, in the terms of this story, there's still no real evidence that there was anything hugely different to this in terms of the case count. We did manage to suppress it. And a large part of that was using old school methods like questionnaires. So that's just, that was our entry point to this story, was that paradox. But then the rest of this story is the use of visual forms from across that visual vocabulary to step people through the rising death toll. Like, how come Italy and South Korea were on the same path but then diverged very quickly? That was because of very different reactions in terms of testing, tracing, and lockdowns. Maps make a return where we want to make that reinforcement point about spatial pattern. And how much of Italy's initial first wave outbreak was concentrated in northern provinces. So this story really fuses and uses those visual forms to actually do the telling of the story. And a couple of things that are emerging out of this, that also just a general points of our strategy. Whether it's a map or a chart, we don't use them in the FT to just say to the reader, here are some numbers. And that kind of lacks the context that people need to understand what they're looking at. Now, normally what happens is you're producing a graphic of some sort because you want to communicate a key point to the reader. And that's why, if you look at all of these graphics, they carry narrative headlines. And what that means is it's kind of making a promise to the reader that we want the graphic to deliver on. So yes, we do tell people what data it is that they're looking at, but the titles turn each and every graphic into a self-contained micro story. And then our job for this story was to simply write around them. So this reverses the traditional journalistic model, which is, a real journalist writes 1,000 words and somebody decorates it with some pie charts and underpants. This is completely the other way around. This is, let's do the research, let's do the analysis, let's lay out a narrative driven by the data, and then write it through. And for me, it makes a very much more cohesive piece of journalism, a more confident piece of journalism as a result. And it was really nice to see that the maps and the charts were received very, very well by readers. There's this concept of 10x or 10 times content. I don't know if people have ever come across this term. I think it's an interesting term. It was coined by somebody called Rand Fishkin to describe content on the web that is 10 times better than the best result that can currently be found in the search results for a given keyword, phrase, or topic. So why is that important? Well, Rand Fishkin argues that's what gives you differentiated content on the web that's sufficient enough to build your content strategy. It's got to be that much better to stand out in the field. And so it was really nice for Rand Fishkin to be saying himself that that story I just showed you was 10x content, and he's added it to his canonical list of 10x content, which is his examples of this is web content that is sufficiently different. And as he notes, in a crowded content field, because we have literally, the amount of information that people have had to consume through news organizations this year has obviously been overwhelming. And of course, it wasn't just COVID, it was the US election as well that has dominated so much of our time in recent months. That brought with it the usual sort of quadrennial discussion about how to present election results, and this was the FT solution this year. Crucially, it wasn't the only solution, because there's an entirely different form of map for the mobile version. And there are always, in every election design process that I've experienced, there's always a crucial new design thing that jumps out at you. Now, at the FT, we're really interested in covering the US election for a global audience, not just the American audience. We like our US readers, we want to grow our US readers, but we also are aware that so many of our readers are not in the US. So we're approaching this as a design challenge slightly differently from the homegrown US news organizations. We're always trying to look at it through the eyes of a global reader rather than a US reader. So this year, the design thing that popped out was the sudden realization, oh my gosh, what about all of these state abbreviations? Who on earth is going to be able to understand them? And we'd spend some time looking at how to abbreviate the names of states. And what we'd found in testing was that the traditional 2-character state codes that Americans are very familiar with, the rest of the world hates. In the testing, there was some really very interesting results that were coming out of some of the abbreviations we were seeing. And one of the things we were realizing here again was just this way that different people can see the same map and understand different things, even with something as sort of geometrically abstract as this election map. It's been absolutely fascinating to see that. And that all of that sort of information has been captured as part of the research, and I'll come back to this point later when it comes to cartographic standards. I mentioned that we'd started writing about maps a couple of years ago. We were quite keen to start writing and explaining our cartographic processes to readers, partly because we know that so many other organizations have challenges in this space. You know, the transition from analog to digital, the constant seduction of using the latest sort of technological tools to produce content. And we thought it would be quite fun to just have a long lens look at how we've produced maps over the years. So Steve Bernard, who's been in the newsroom for more than 2 decades now, wrote this, and I think it was his first solo byline in the FT, which is crazy given how talented Steve is. But Steve wrote this lovely piece, a little homage to cartography as it's transcended the decades in the FT newsroom. And it was lovely in doing that piece that we were moving our head office last year at the same time. And so we found these big time capsules of maps that used to be used for digitizing and tracing on newsroom deadlines. I mean, that was not cartography for the faint-hearted, but this kind of concept that cartography is a skill and a process that lives through the evolution of the newsroom is fascinating, because I think you know, so much of what we're doing in the news industry is subject to existential crises. You know, like you're no longer printing newspapers, you've got to do it online. You know, you're no longer selling advertising, you want subscribers. And so cartography as a constant has been absolutely fascinating, but has not stood still either, as you can kind of see, and as you will see with some of the examples I'll show you in a moment. We also use those opportunities to write about maps, to talk about maps with people that we were really fascinated to learn more from. I loved the interview that I did with Marc Monmonier about how to lie with maps, because it gave me a chance to talk about some of my favorite bad maps, which include this beautiful 19th century map of Poitiers, which is actually cartographically beautiful. The only main flaw in this map is that Poitiers never existed, and it was used as part of a fraudulent scheme by Gregor MacGregor. And of course, you know, the fact that lying with maps is something that refuses to go away, you know, meant that this is actually a ripe topic. You know, our readers loved this sort of discussion. These articles generated lots of feedback from people. We were worried when we published them that people thought, oh, this is just nerds in the corner of the newsroom and no one's going to be interested in this. But it surprised us how broad an audience these articles gained. So much so that we've really kind of embraced the idea that actually education in terms of cartography and geography is one of our goals. That's one of the things that we really want to support. And the thing that's really lovely about that is the FT has a very active schools program, which means that a lot of the content that we produce gets repurposed into lesson plans for students. And I think the FT schools program is great because schools have got free access to the FT, which is one of the things we are really keen to kind of flag up. The other thing is, you know, we've been keen to push resources as much as we can. We're just printing thousands of copies of the visual vocabulary for school classrooms across the UK. We're trying to get one in every secondary school, I think is the plan. But I've also got to give a shout out to Alistair Monteith at Gordonstown, who seems to be single-handedly taking some of our best visual and cartographic journalism and turning them into lesson plans. And it's the sort of thing that when I was a geography student would have loved. I really would have loved to unpick some of this stuff in different ways by critiquing the design questions. And in fact, so good are these lesson plans that some of the questions that Alistair asks and poses to students mirrors real discussions in the newsroom about how to do this stuff. So, for example, what alternative methods of data presentation, apart from the choropleth map, could be used in the project, you know, in the story I just showed you on Italy's outbreak? That was a very real discussion in the newsroom. Should it be a map? Shouldn't it be a map? You've seen the visual vocabulary in action, and that's what we want people to become confident doing. I mentioned cartographic standards. This is another thing that's really, really important, which is I feel like when you're a certain size of organization, one of the things that you really have to try and do is to capture your values, not just in a mission statement or a sort of very high level explanation of what you're trying to do, but deep standards that are exposed for the team to take ownership of. And we've tried to apply that with our cartographic standards. So everything from what projections should we use for mapping certain parts of the world, to how to brew your own, to how to make that North Korea missile map that everybody keeps asking us for. All of that sort of stuff is enshrined in standards. We feel that that kind of base cartographic literacy is something that we're trying to capture as a sort of body of knowledge. A combination of best practice in the field that we've picked up on from all of the wonderful people outside of the FT, some of whom are dialed into this meeting and to whom I say thank you, but also from some of our own experiences in reader reactions to the maps and cartographic work that we produce. It's not just restricted either to, you know, projections. That lovely state abbreviation debacle that I showed earlier has found its way into our standards for names and codes for places. Martin Schnaber, my colleague, has painstakingly compiled a lot of this sort of information into our playbook, into our kind of standards book. And that also applies to tools as well, about making sure that people are comfortable about where to get help to produce content. Some of you will be familiar with Steve Bernard's QGIS video tutorials. They're part of our own resource library that we use, along with all sorts of other things that help us to get to that breaking news map quicker. I thought I'd finish off by talking a little bit, just showing you some examples actually of some of the other cartography that has come out this year through some specific examples that I didn't want to miss out the chance to talk to you or to show you. And just to, again, just shout out here that I really am very much the Ringo Starr with one hand tied behind his back, that this group of people here are such a wonderful, talented group of people to be working with. And they've done some great work this year. One of the things that we did right at the start of the year, which I really enjoyed being a part of, was we decided to put together a series. So, on the back of the Chart Doctor series, we decided it would be, you know, these FT readers are so interested in maps, we should do a video series about maps and kind of their role in the news. And this was great fun. If nothing else, it was just a great excuse to talk to some great cartographers, people in the field who we'd admired. That included Alistair Ray when he started to produce his new work on spatial inequality in the UK. That was our kickoff video in the series. Then we had James Cheshire join me for a talk about gerrymandering, and it allowed me to bring out some of my favourite gerrymandered US voting districts, the earmuffs there, I think, by James, but there are some better ones as well. Gerrymandering. We then also found some wonderful data for the US, which I'll show you in a moment, but we couldn't find another FT story to include this in, so we did something else separate for it, deliberately dedicated to this video series. I'll show you in a moment. But then by the time we got to produce the 4th episode in the series, we were talking about how to map disease, and I had a great chat in lockdown with Ken Field, about, you know, again, coronavirus being a chance to reflect on something that's actually been done for centuries. And again, all of these videos received great engagement from our readers. They're all available on the FT's YouTube channel if you're interested in following up on them. But that was for us, that was a great start to the year, but then the year just got increasingly weirder after that. I'm just going to show you that third installment. This for me was a really lovely, a rare chance to just play cartographic data. Now, I did a year of my undergrad degree at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So I get emails from the Colorado Geography Department's newsletter. And one of the things that stood out on a newsletter a little while ago was they said, oh, we've opened up some data, made available some data that allows us to see when each little square, I think it was 200 meters square, if I remember correctly, each 200 meter square unit of land in the US, if it's built up when it was first built up. And that struck me as being a really fascinating thing to have a look at, you know, to actually sort of look at sort of urban growth and the spread and the development of the US. The great thing was they said, oh, you know, we can do this going back to 1810. So I talked to Steve Bernard and had the idea that what we could do is actually, he said, I think we should go away and look at the growth of the infrastructure around that as well. So he said, we're going to digitize loads of old railroad maps and bring that together with this data. And so for an actual Maptastic video, it was me and Steve talking about it. But I think this is in some ways much more interesting. You can't see it initially. Each built up area is a little tiny yellow set of pixels. And what you're seeing just animating there are the first initial transport links coming in across that development. So going through to 1865 and then finally towards the second half of the 19th century, the kind of connection made out to the West Coast. This for us was just really fascinating. As people who love maps, this was just a wonderful thing to be looking at and playing with. Just sort of using maps for that lovely idea of just kind of contextualizing somewhere that we're all pretty familiar with these days, but just how did that come to pass? I think what's really nice is in the second half of this video, the transport connections by now, of course, have been established. Now we can really just start to see how these yellow pixelated areas grow. And that kind of growth of the US is just this wonderful visual. It's kind of addictive actually watching this, I think. You can kind of love it. Right at the end of the video, the other thing that we did was, because we can date each of these pixels to a specific year, we then threw a kind of banded treatment at it. There you go. So now that's actually all of those built up areas shaded by when they were first built. It was a fascinating project. We really enjoyed it. Then, of course, we were talking about coronavirus. Now, in the early days of coronavirus, we were still, I would say, catching up to what was going on around the world and thinking about the best way of bringing the latest developments to readers. And I think we saw a lot of this, not just from the FT, but from news organizations around the world, that maps with circles ended up being a familiar sight. Right? Like it was a good crisis as far as cartography was concerned in terms of people's exposure to it. What we dialed back from fairly quickly was just this sort of visual prominent coverage dominating our coverage. And in fact, this was another Steve Bernard creation, which was the idea of using a stream graph, which is another chart type from our visual vocabulary, to actually is a much more effective way of showing the geographical progression of COVID death toll over time. Absolutely, again, reinforcement of that visual strategy I talked about earlier. This map went up in the last week or so. This is nitrogen dioxide emissions from Steve again, who's a whiz at animating maps like this. Really, these maps, I have to say, have absolutely dominated our visual presence on Instagram. They are tremendously popular on social media. They're highly engaging. We know that they're actually more shared and more bookmarked than in photographs, which when you think about that for Instagram, which is a website originally really based on photo sharing, that is a good thing for cartography that it can go to those places and dominate like that. Maps from across the world this year. Who remembers the Australian bushfires? The fact we're still worried about surveillance society, how there are still very specific geographical stories across the world that require coverage, and we're trying to do our best to bring cartography to bear on that. Even down to precinct level map analysis from John Murdoch and Christine Zhang on voting trends in this most entertaining of presidential elections. I also ought to have a shout out to this particular piece, which was almost like for me, again, really appreciating the team members that we work with, almost like a Harlem Globetrotters piece, this, with Steve Bernard, Ian Bott, Chris Campbell involved in this one. This kind of mixture of cartography and illustration, incredibly powerful. I love the submarine robot on the right, because I learned a lot about it from Ian's illustration. Although it's currently exploring the Thwaites Glacier, that robot is intended to be deployed on Europa to look for life, which I think is, well, that's a nice one other thing for that story, but some really fascinating stuff. So that's really all I wanted to cover. I think I was going to round off this talk by talking about future challenges until I realized that's a disastrous move, because who knows, right? Like, just keeping up with current challenges is a challenge all by itself. Reflecting on what we've done with data this year, what we've done with maps and graphics, are there things that retrospectively I think we'll want to come back and look at? I think there are certainly some things. The first thing that stood out for me was that this, above all else, this has been a year of uncertainty. And one of the things that I'm kind of conscious of is that whenever we put a map in front of people, it presents generally a very certain view of whatever the phenomenon is being mapped. And so I am interested in future to think, just as we are with our other data visualizations, what can we be doing to reflect uncertainty better on maps? All of the usual research challenges about getting cartography onto mobile devices and so on. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have specifically. And with that, I will pause. Let me just come out of the presentation and stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you very much for that. Yes, extremely fascinating and enlightening talk, and thank you too for the offer to take questions. I can't see any at the moment. Just a reminder to everybody that if you want to put in a question, I see some are using chat. There's also the Q&A tool itself, which comes through the activities tab on the top right of your screens. I think we'll have to have this. It looks like we'll have two matching up two streams of questions. I think there's a couple there, Alan, in chat. Yes, right. So I can see one there from, what a surprise, Peter, with a map projections. Absolutely right. Like that is a perennial topic, of course. You know, in fact, I think map projections for me sits alongside two other visual variables that people become incredibly kind of personally involved with. So I would say, and I don't know in which order this actually applies, but map projections, color, and fonts, right? Those three things, absolutely. You know, who wouldn't welcome discussions about those things, because people feel so attached to them. I actually did one project last year which introduced a fourth, which was I did a data sonification exercise where we turned data into music, and actually choice of instrument is equally it's going to be another list addition to the list. But anyway, going back to the point from Peter, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we would like to be labelled as one of the news organisations that get mapped projections wrong. I would probably say, just as with any cartographer, you kind of look back at your past work and think, you know, what would I have done to improve that? And occasionally you'll see things where, you know, you kind of think, yes, well, maybe we should have tweaked the map projection on that, and so on. But I think we start from a place which is, how is geography affecting the story that we're trying to show?
and to use that as the generation for thinking about our map projection. So I don't deny that there might not occasionally be a glitch. I suffered myself from a QGIS projection glitch last year, which I was really embarrassed about, but generally take it seriously. We try not to do evil with map projections. I wonder sometimes if we do enough in terms of educating people about why it matters. I know there are lots of great cartographic resources. We should sometimes do more to get them in front of people who need to know a bit more about the topic. Right.
We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A bit now. Alan, if you want to switch over to that.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, right. Right, so first question from Warren. We use Dubai, D-U-B-A-I, I think. Yeah. Ken, did we consider going with the full names on the waffle grid? Yeah, we could well have done, actually. The way that our publishing system uses at the moment, we can actually afford ourselves 3 variants of any map that we publish. So we can go like, we have to have a mobile and then one that's bigger than mobile. And in fact, we can then go super big if we want to take up the reader's screen. We very often try and use that variation in size to make sure that graphics are radically different in each size setting, because in fact in the most extreme cases we can sometimes use something that is a map big might be a bar chart when it's small, because that kind of presentation context changes. Again, just retrospectively, there's probably things where we would want to go back and say, you know, how could we have done that? Could we have done it better? Yeah, Dan, full names on the waffle grid. We could have. Yes, you're right. Alexander, what do you think makes a map believable? For many people, the fact that it exists. You know, the thing that was fascinating talking to Marc Marmonier and reading his book, which is full of examples about how maps have been politicized, is they're really powerful, right? The fact that they exist means that they receive some sort of kind of magical authority that words don't. Right, like I think that's why maps can be so powerful. There's a couple of fantastic examples that we used in that Chart Doctor article, where the fact that people believe them makes you kind of wince. You know, absolutely. What makes it believable? That it exists is as simple as that. Do you have a policy to produce colorblind friendly maps? Yes. I'm glad someone has raised this question, because we have got some real challenges when we come to using colour, as a lot of news organisations do. And it's not just a case of adapting for colourblind readers, which is obviously important, but actually in some ways it's not the most extreme, because the most extreme thing is black and white print, which is what the FT is still printed in many locations across the world. So very often, you know, in fact, earlier this year, we had to intercept a map that was going off to print that had a kind of deviation color scheme on it that would have looked identical in both directions in black and white. And so, yeah, we do have color palettes that we try to use, that we've tested, that make use of the sort of psychophysics of color perception. Sometimes, as ever, it gets close to the mark, you know, but we really do take accessibility quite important, and colours on our data visualizations are a big part of that. Symbols versus choropleth, still a hard rule. Yeah, I don't like proportional symbols with absolute values. I think that's something that's quite lazy, and we've seen a lot of it this year in COVID. It doesn't help many people when you present maps in that context. I'm trying to think of any good examples where absolute values and proportional symbols, I'm struggling. I think also choropleths, though, you know, you have the reverse pattern. Obviously, sometimes you don't want to be producing, sorry, I got that the wrong way around. Choropleths with rates I'm sorry, it's been a long day. Choropleths with rates, fine. Choropleths with counts, not so good. Symbols where you're just putting blobs on maps that are basically population centres, that's been my big problem with COVID mapping this year. And is it a hard rule? Yeah, we tend to use symbols for counts and choropleths for rates. I think there's still examples where both of those situations still aren't optimal for a reader. Posters in schools from Jason. Hi, Jason. How are we going to manage the future generations of Carto-savvy, graphically competent data skeptics? I mean, absolutely, education, right? So I've got a slight theory just in general about the visual vocabulary and what we've learned from showing it to people, which is when I say to people, if you ignore maps for a minute, when I say to people, right, tell me about 3 different ways of presenting data, and people will say, oh, you know, pie chart, line chart, bar chart. And you say, great, okay. When did you learn them? People generally say primary school. And then you say, right, and when did you learn your 4th kind of data visualization? And that's when the conversation gets difficult. We think that there's been this big gap in the educational curricula, which is possible to avoid entirely if you pursue an arts course, and even if you pursued a science course and picked up some of it, you very rarely get taught how to present to people who are not like you. And so I think there's a real challenge here for us to level up the skill sets at the school age, because sometimes, to be honest, despite our best efforts, people, by the time they're in their 30s and 40s, a lot of people have sort of have already put the shutters up in terms of how far they're prepared to go to accept that your idea to do a chord diagram is the right one. What data format do you prefer working with? Anything that's clean. The thing that really struck me moving from the civil service to the FT was I didn't know how easy I had it for so many years at ONS that I worked alongside the people actually producing data. So I could go and round the corner and talk to the very people compiling the release that I was going to be working with, and have a good old chat and talk about the structure of the file they're going to send me and everything. That was dead easy. I could zoom up the road to Ordnance Survey and get my map bases and my GIS files from the friends up there, and my life was pretty easy, I'd have to say. At the FT, I'm very often sent photographs of information on pieces of paper, which is probably at one end of the information spectrum. It's never as clean as we want it, and I think we should kind of conceive of a prize for reporters who produce clean spreadsheets to spread the good practice. So you must have a good filing system to store all those maps. Yeah. Oh, actually, by the way, on formats, by the way, we've started using geodatabases in QGIS a lot more, and we found a lot of love for them this year. Sorry, forgot to say that. You must have a good filing system to store all those maps and find them again. Oh, Google Drive. Google Drive is a phenomenal thing these days. We use Google Drive a lot at the FT. And that has been a lifesaver while people have been working remotely. It's really, we had this big challenge in March to know whether we could produce a global newspaper and print it 250,000 times and send it around the world. If we could do that from our bedrooms, and I'm amazed. And part of that is, you know, having the tools that allow you to find content quickly. That's a really good question from Claire about readership and maps. I don't think we've ever done anything specifically on maps, but we are very often keen to understand more about our readers and how they're engaging with our content. The thing that we can say about visual journalism in general is that it's generally more popular in Europe and North America, and more popular within that with younger readers. So, I mean, which is interesting actually, because I do think for a global news organization, the the use of visual journalism is actually a good thing because it's universal and the graphics translate sometimes better than words. We've translated the visual vocabulary into Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, and French, because we think it is that kind of resource that transfers quite well. Yeah, it's a good question there, Claire. Oh, hi, Ken. Does having to use the FT salmon pink cause any design problems? Yes. FFF 1E5, it does. It's a bit of a problem because it takes some of your luminance away from the outset, right? So that's the first problem, is it's not white, and so you're already somewhere along the scale. And of course, then there's the design aesthetic of what looks good against salmon pink, which is always a good fun challenge. Luckily, we have an absolutely superb user experience designer in Caroline Nevitt, who keeps us on the straight and narrow on things like color and accessibility. Hi, Paul. You've mentioned QGIS a few times. Do you have any others? So QGIS is our staple. There are things that operate in what I would call the Bernard orbit of extra tools that people use from time to time, things like geolayers. Steve does a lot of work in After Effects. He uses Blender for 3D rendering. We also use R for producing maps as well. So people like John Byrne Murdoch, very proficient at command line mapping as well. So yeah, I love QGIS, partly because it's so, the thing that's quite nice about all of this stuff is you can kind of say, yes, it's lovely at the FT that we've got these people, but all we're showing when we do this well is how far the industry's come with the tooling that comes out the box. I mean, my cartography course in Colorado was ink and vellum, and I think I was on ArcInfo version 2 when I did my GIS course there. And at the time, I was so dismissive of GIS because I thought we're just never going to get that level of cartographic quality that I'm going to get off of this pen. And of course, I'm now happy to be entirely disproven. I love QGIS, even though I am slightly annoyed with its user interface at times. And that's probably to do with my fading memory of which buttons to click. I think that's, yeah. I see Peter's message about pink. The story of the pink is interesting, is that when the FT was first published as pink newspaper back at the end of the 19th century, it was pink because that was the cheapest paper that we could use to publish it. Now it's the most expensive, that particular form of pink. And in fact, I took the team on a tour of the FT's print facility in Bow in London about 18 months ago, and it was still, for me, one of the most fascinating days at the FT was actually seeing it printed. It was absolutely, we had the most hardened GitHub front-end dev developers who loved it, right? And were just smitten by just watching this newspaper get printed and compiled. It was an absolutely amazing evening. Right, and then Devinder's question, does overloading information on maps, does this come at a cost of losing that traditional approach to maps? I mean, I guess there's something fairly profound there about analog versus digital design, which is I think you should try with digital design to make sure that you're being subtractive, in that you're, it's quite difficult to pick like a digital map up and to shake it until all of the stuff that's irrelevant on it falls off, because it's quite sticky content. Whereas the sort of reverse, in the analog world, it was all your decision about what ink to push onto the paper. So, I mean, I think there is a fundamental philosophical difference in design that doesn't just apply to cartography, but just to everything. It's much easier to saturate everything, absolutely. And what we should be doing is, providing clarity, so that doesn't always tally up.
Right, that's, I think, exhausted the stream of questions, Alan. So thank you extremely once again for a very enlightening talk, and one which seems to have caught everybody's imagination.